So John Innes is now going to give us some background on the birds. Over to you, John.
Thanks, Adrian. Can you see the screen?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, morena tato, ko John Innes aho. I'm talking to you from sunny Kirikiriroa in Hamilton. So as Susan has explained, the More Birds in the Bush program is aiming to halt declines of mainland forest birds, hopefully to better understand how their populations work, perhaps to predict threats, and so make predator control more efficient and other management actions. And in this talk, I'm really just going to introduce some key concepts and I think a few key words, and later speakers are going to have more to say about most of the points that I introduce in my slides. Okay. So endemic birds matter most. It's not a scientific statement, that's a sort of a statement of values, I guess. So endemicity and this expression deep endemics is going to come up fairly often in the next couple of days. So the endemicity is really an attribute of the sort of the length of evolution or the antiquity of species in New Zealand, and we have an endemic order of birds, which is kiwi, and then endemic family like the wattle birds or our parrots, and then endemic genera like bellbird and tui. And of course, it's the deep endemics that are really special in New Zealand. They tend to have particular vulnerabilities and traits, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, but of course they're the ones that we have the most international responsibility to look after, and they're the ones that are in the most trouble. I just want to talk about this thing, limiting factor. We're going to hear quite a lot of that. This has become, for me, I think, a really sharp key way to look at how to improve populations. So populations tend to oscillate around a particular level. I suppose they're really stable in any real sense, but kind of when births and immigration, about equal deaths and immigration as resources and other things go up and down. The processes determining that is limitation, and any factor that you can alter those rates of any one of those components is a limiting factor. And there's a few examples there, and I guess there's a bit of a predominance at the moment about predation, and we want in this program to take a really good look at things like food supply. There's also things like disease, obviously forest area in some places, and this can be intra-specific, you know, from another species, or inter-specific, something just like competition or territory space. So that's limiting factors. These are complicated things. They're layered, of course. As soon as you take one away, there's another one. No population's ever free of them. No population grows infinitely. If you take away predation in an eco-sanctuary or something, or an island, something else will pop up. It might be density, territory space. They can vary in time. You might have a beach mast year or a particular weather year, and it will be different this year to last year. So that can be between or within a species. And one of the big ones for me is that it's just a language thing, is that we talk about predators, and I don't know that predator-free New Zealand helps, but in fact, two of those main predators, shiprats and possums, are omnivores, of course, and they also remove food, and it's the detail of those mechanisms. If you take out predation, you're also perhaps increasing food supply. So a primary limiting factor has got the biggest impact, so the population increases the most when that particular thing is removed. And it's a great way to look at how to make things better for our population. The word habitat's a hoary old chestnut, and it's been subject to quite a few international reviews about what it means, because it's misused so much, especially in publications. So it's the resources and conditions present in an area that produced occupancy for a given organism. So habitat is profoundly a species concept. You know, what's habitat for a takahe isn't habitat for a privatus necessarily. We're inclined to use it instead of vegetation. We say, oh, you know, this forest is good habitat, but that, you know, the habitat's been cleared, whatever. I mean, it's true in a sense, but it doesn't just equal vegetation. We're inclined also to not include predators. We say, oh, the habitat's great, but it's full of predators. Well, in that case, the habitat isn't great. And habitat quality is one of the derivatives of the word. We think of it, well, there's a per capita contribution to population growth expected from a given habitat, and it's best measured by vital rates. So the vital rates are things like fecundity or mortality. It's the number of eggs that are laid, or the rate at which juveniles are killed, perhaps. So it's something sharp. Some of the intrinsic, unescapable, evolved traits of these old forest birds, things like cavity nesting, large body size, limited mobility, flightlessness, we're really familiar with this. And limitations and interaction between those and the environment at the time, and there on the right-hand side of the slide is the things that used to limit forest birds. There was predation, of course, forever and ever, but they were birds, they weren't mammals, and of course there was intense competition if things were in very high numbers. And forest was always limited, albeit at a much, much larger scale, of course. And what's happened now is that the left-hand side of this has stayed the same. The traits are the same, but the extrinsic factors are all different. And so, in a nutshell, this is the problem for forest birds, really, in one slide. And it's a bit ironic, maybe there's less avian predation now. I mean, laughing owls have gone, and the eagles have gone, and the big harrier has gone, and perhaps less competition, but it's all been gazumped really by the two at the bottom, maybe the three at the bottom. Heavily fragmented forest, especially in lowlands, and mammalian predation and competition. It takes, the research is at least long-winded, if not extremely hard. It probably took us 25 years to go through these steps to determine a cause of decline for North Island kōkako, for example. You've really got to get a population abundance measure and then go back later and get another abundance measure that gives you a robust indication of whether things are declining, increasing, or staying the same. And that takes a while for a bird. And then you've got to kind of do some educated thinking about the pattern of decline and what might be the cause, and then perhaps find places with and without that cause, and best of all, if you can challenge that with an experiment, and then study the demographic response to that experiment and see how it fits in with what you thought. And it's all fairly time consuming. I guess we've got used to the idea, and we've previously published, of course, that pest mammals predation is probably the primary current factor limiting forest birds nationally now, and there's a lot of evidence for that, and I won't go through all this because this is pretty well known. But I suppose the big obvious one is that birds tend to thrive on pest-free islands, and they don't do so well on the mainland. And a lot of recent experimentation, especially with eco-sanctuaries, I think has given support to the predation hypothesis. You're going to hear things in the workshop, as Susan has already said. She's shown this about warm forests and cold forests. Most of the cold forests are beech forests, and there are thermal refuges consistent with this predation hypothesis. And this is data from Susan and Adrian's analysis of the two bird atlases from field work in the 1970s and then the early 2000s. And so from the solid line, from the solid grey line to the dashed grey line is occupancy of riflemen across this temperature gradient. And you can see that they have retained occupancy at high altitudes, but not at low altitudes. And it's the same in the South Island, and that's probably a predation outcome. Trying to tease apart limiting factors in birds is not that easy necessarily, sometimes because in this sort of highlighted example, these squares, that things like poor egg, chick, or adult survival can be characteristic of both. And of course, these interact sometimes. Maybe if birds are preyed on, that they were short of food, or something drew attention to the nest in some food supply way. So this takes quite a lot of detailed study to sort out. And Schlesselman has analysed this in a bit more detail. She was looking at these key demographic steps. Here's a kind of it's a sort of a schema, I guess, or a concept of at our site, which is the dashed red line. You've got basal productivity, which is determined perhaps by climate, geology, altitude, and vegetation. I mean, we're not used to squaring those things up against bird populations, but it would be interesting to to do more of that about the effects of altitude and fertility on production. But then there are those key life stages: fecundity, the number of fledged young per female, juvenile survival, adult survival, and together those combine to forge the growth rate or otherwise of a bird population. And of course, there's immigration and immigration if birds can reach the site. Whoops. The trouble is that pest mammals gazump all of those. They can eat eggs, they can eat juveniles, and they can eat adults. We know examples of all of those. Anne went through an elicitation process with experts because really not much is known about the effects of mammals in detail on these particular life stages. And she talked to experts about deriving density impact functions, the effect of the predators on each of these rates in particular, and discovered that we know a lot more about nest success than sub-adult and adult survival. And I think it's because it's so much easier to work. You can slap a camera on a nest. You can't slap cameras on mobile sub-adults and adults. There's reasonable information for this kind of density impact function relationship between pest levels and outcomes for kōkako and for North Island robins and some for kiriru and not many other species. There's lots of old studies like the ones from Kowhai Bush in the 1980s with birds, but they didn't really link it to mammals. And Anne found there weren't many people familiar with both birds and the mammals for elicitation, and those people found their estimating really hard with a lot of certainty around their estimates. Right, one of the processes you're going to hear quite a lot about is beach masts and beach mast cascades. And because people always take one of Graham Elliott's teas off, we put another one on just to compensate in this slide. This is just one template for what can happen in a beach forest. It's at one end of, if you like, of a spectrum. So you're probably familiar with this, but in summer there's can be large-scale beach flowering, seed fall in the autumn, and then there's seed on the ground in the following spring. And rats and mice respond to this greatly. This is, as I said, this is at one end of the beach mast cascade. So the rats in this case are starting fairly low. So the rats are high following the beach mast, and they run out of food, and then they crash a year later. Stoats are preying on the rats and mice. Their numbers will peak also in the summer of the mast, and then there's a bit of a bounce the following year, and then they also go back down to low numbers. There's good mohua breeding, for example, a bird that's characteristic of these forests before the high numbers. It's terrible during these numbers. It's okay a year later, and then it's good again afterwards. And so this kind of cycle you're going to hear quite a lot about in the next couple of days. Susan talked about, warmer forests and podocarp broadleaf forests, and just make the point that there's a real gradient. I mean, there are podocarp forests with some beach, and in a way, vice versa. But in general, the dynamics of mammals in these two systems are really different, and we're going to have to bear that in mind in conversations. I'm not aware of anyone in the North Island using fruiting and podocarp forests to time pest control, but we know, for example, that kōkako have big years and small years, and it could be done. We just, at the moment, we don't seem to do it. In beach forests, rats, mice, and stoats are all eruptive, as I've just shown, and possums tend not to be common. But in podocarp broadleaf forests, where I've worked most of my life, shiprats are always abundant. They're always above damage levels. Mice are really scarce, probably because of the high shiprat numbers. And stoats, I don't think, are common. But possums are abundant. So shiprats and possums are routinely abundant. Food supply is a thing of really growing interest for me. I've seen there were hypotheses, I guess, that food limited takahe, whio, and kōkako, but now management for those three birds all focuses on predators. But nevertheless, food clearly drives the breeding attempts of some of these birds. And most famously, kakapo, of course, they only nest big time when there's lots of remu seed fall. Kaka and kiriru famously nest when there's a lot of fruit. And kōkako, as I said, have big years and small years. There's a kind of I think I've had the impression that insectivores might be less affected. But Beck Bolton found in work at Bennydale that North Island robin nest survival increased with invert abundance in the territories. And Rogan Colborne tells me that the mean weight of little spotted kiwi on Kapiti Island, 1,200 grams, and they have one egg clutch a year, but if you translocate them They double their weight and they have two egg clutches a year, and that's an insectivore. And just to continue with kiwi, these are data from Isabel Castro and her lovely long-term study on Ponui Island. It's a very big drought in May 2020, and the long-term mean female weight of these are North Island brown kiwi now, dropped from 2.5 to 1.6 kg, and the long-term male weight dropped from 1.9 to 1.25, and a quarter of their transmitted kiwi died. So here's a graph of rainfall from 2004 to 2020, and the small years are just the years where in aggregate across the year there's not much rain. But she's looked at weight loss and gain. So this is females in the pink and males in the blue, of course. But 2020, tremendous weight loss. But you can go back to other years like 2013, where again there's small rainfall and substantial weight loss. And I know that the Kiwi Recovery Program now consider dogs, ferrets, and drought to be key issues that they should deal with. We know who the likely food diverters are. Here are 4 of them. These numbers, this looks at the weight of resource, it might be inverts or flowers and fruit, eaten by these animals at mean densities in a hectare. These are indefensibly precise numbers, but the order of magnitude is worth passing on. We published this in 2010, just from best available information, and the kilograms per night, I did it for the Tauruas because this workshop was originally going to be in Wellington. It's just one way to look at it. So there's 9 tons of inverts and flowers fruit removed by ship rats a night in the Tauruas, 29 tons by possums, 29,600 kilograms. And it just, obviously there's error bars around this and they're worth whole papers by themselves, but if you imagine 29 tons of food dumped in the Tauruas and made available for birds and invertebrates, you could start to conceive the kind of impacts that this food removal might have. 76,000 tons for hedgehogs, that will be the least accurate because there's only one density estimate for that for hedgehogs, and it's probably not accurate, and I won't get into red deer much here, but you can imagine. Okay, there's all kinds of negative effects of these animals, and the mechanisms that they work through is of interest to us. I think probably the best example of disruption is the decades-long work by Dave Kelly, Jenny Ladley, and Al Robertson, and a host of others on pollination and dispersal, seed dispersal, the disruption of those mutualisms by pest mammals via birds. Pest mammals tend to prey on seeds, they're inefficient dispersers. Joe Carpenter found that on islands where there were weka, 76% of henile seed was dispersed. On the mainland, it was only 4%. Some experimental support for this is that seed dispersal and pollination have both been shown to improve with pest eradication and fenced ecosanctuaries, and invertebrate communities certainly change. And the final thing, it's kind of a double whammy for these deep endemics, because not only are they most impacted by mammals, but they're also least likely to be able to move back to or recolonize or reconnect forest areas that become isolated. So this is an analysis we did of all the available evidence in literature for gap crossing by forest birds. So this is really interesting work for people thinking of making corridors. And so this graph shows gap crossing distance, and just it's a log scale at the bottom, but obviously a big list of species. We identified a dozen species that are strongly or moderately gap limited. That is, they have trouble crossing these gaps. So there's kōkako, whitehead, saddleback, and kiwi, strongly gap limited, not known to cross more than 500 meters between forest areas. And mohua, tiripunami rifleman, brown creeper, weka, teki, saddleback, and both robins and meadow, tomtits, moderately gap limited, won't cross 5K. And so these birds also can't get back to forests if they are removed from them. And Kevin Park has reminded us during the preparation of this paper that in an ironic way, connected sites also enable translocated birds to disperse. We might hear more about that later. Okay, so in summary, the original evolved bird traits and behaviors are maladapted for pest mammals and extensive forest clearance. This is a forest bird problem in a nutshell. we conceive, probably correctly, that mammalian predation is the current primary national limiting factor. We can all think of sites, so perhaps Hawke's Bay or Central Waikato or Manawatu, where forest clearance must be a primary factor at lots of regional sites. I'm increasingly interested in food supply as a secondary factor of limitation where forest is intact. And pest mammals do a whole lot of stuff. I mean, we talk so much about predators, we think of predation, but in fact, they divert food from native species. They disrupt nests and roosts. Deer trample on invertebrates and kill them that way. They're changing microclimates in forests, disrupting mutualisms. There's a whole lot of things that they do. And I've come to think that the ecology of food supply is complex, but it greatly deserves study, and we're going to hear more about it in the next couple of days. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John. Can I just remind everybody that if you've got questions to ask, can you just type them in the chat and I will read them out to John? No questions yet. Okay, so I've got a question, John. So assuming Predatory 2050 is successful, will that be enough? And if not, what do you think is the next thing off the block that we're going to need to address?
Well, it will be enough for some things, I think, but I've got a couple of provisos. I personally think that eradicating just one of the things like possums might actually be, I think you could eradicate any one of the key three that everybody talks about and it might help vegetation. But if shiprats increase with complete possum removal, then something like kokako may have a net loss, and things that are just shiprat vulnerable may be worse off. And so you could imagine, I think that a big theme of eco-sanctuaries was that everything should be removed at the same time, and that would include mice. I mean, we know already that if you take away shiprats, stoats, and possums, that you'll get lots and lots of mice because we live and breathe in eco-sanctuaries. So I'd like to see the list has to be wider for restoration, just like a fenced eco-sanctuary, perhaps 14 species of mammal and not 3. The next big thing, Adrian, for me is actually habitat restoration. I would love to go down through the list of all the threatened species on DOC's books and see how much are likely predation and how much are habitat destruction. But I think there's a huge amount of habitat destruction. It's not just planting, it's stopping people from clearing, tussock and drylands, or from irrigating places that should be dry. Or so there's a lot of habitat repair work from wilding pines through to replanting.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Okay, question from Debs Martin. Sorry, I can't make the chat box on my thing, so this might be awkward. But regarding eating food supply, you had wasps with a question mark, but didn't comment on it. Please, can you do so?
I think wasps could be really, well, we already know that wasps are very significant in beech forest in particular, where their numbers seem to reach much higher numbers. I think recent work by Jacqueline Beggs has shown that the paper wasps, in fact, are more widespread on islands than German wasps. And so I think even the word wasp has perhaps broadened a little in the last couple of years. There is no doubt that these things harvest invertebrates, and I know that we have threatened butterflies and things. I don't know how tight the links are between wasp predation and those taxa, but it's clearly unhelpful. And actually, just as a prompt, I mean, I'd like to say I haven't mentioned plant pests at all, but in fact, plant pests do all these things as well. They also divert, biomass and alter microclimates and other things. And so, yeah, that's absolutely, yeah. Wasps are an issue at some places and sites, and it would be great to have more work done on them. And plant pests are clearly part of this, the subject area, but they're not in my talk. Yeah.
Cool, thank you, John. Question from Josh says, why do you think stoats aren't abundant in warm forests?
I don't know. I don't know if someone else who might know more about stoats than me could address that. Unless maybe cats are more abundant up here and cats eat stoats. I mean, I don't know. We just don't see stoats. I don't think we see stoats a lot on the North Island. I know Craig Gillies tried to catch them at Predatory and there weren't very many there. I think I've read the Mammals Handbook, and there's certainly the peak densities are higher in the South Island. Someone else may wish to comment on that.
Yeah, that might be something that we can address directly with the questioner. To John from Dave Kelly, so since we can't eliminate mice, are they the ultimate remaining problem?
Well, they certainly are for taxa that have previously survived in crevices and things, and the obvious one is lizards. And so you look at things like chevron skink on Aotea, and I mean, I used to say in my talks to people that there were no refuges. It was a kind of a bird comment, and I think for lizards, there actually are. That's exactly how they have survived, is that they, with low metabolic rates, they can live in crevices. Yes, mice, I think, are going to be the last pest standing, and I think they're extremely difficult. I think they're really difficult at a human level, because you can have 20 mice in a pantry and they're kind of not scared of people the way that humans are. I think the human annoyance factor of mice could be really large, as well as their ecological impacts. And yes, I mean, mice won't affect, kokako and maybe not, the bigger birds, but then again, they might, of course, because of course in the South Atlantic islands, they've famously been filmed eating albatrosses and large seabirds, and I think that scared people a little, although that was maybe a situation that wouldn't repeat here in New Zealand. But one does wonder what the limits to predation of mice are. But yes, they're certainly, at the moment, they're the one that is in the too hard basket, I think.
Mm-hmm. Another question, birds may be getting disadvantaged by drought, but has this been looked at in relation to how pests are affected as a result of those same drought conditions? Are pests disadvantaged, or is it all bad news?
I know of no study that has looked at the effects of drought on pests. There's obviously a huge meteorological connection with like delta T with forming mast, the role of climate in driving phenology events, and certainly rising temperatures, as Susan mentioned in her introduction, will favour the expansion of ship rats, which evolved in India and are probably warm adapted, unlike Norway rats. Drought itself, I don't know of any work. No, I don't know.
Okay.
I think rabbits are very happy in dry conditions, aren't they, with aridity? But I know of no other connection with forest predators myself.
Okay, thinking of lowland areas interspersed with small SNAs so that's significant natural areas, on private land and connectivity for forest birds, are linking these with narrow corridors going to be helpful, or should we be aiming to make these SNAs bigger? i.e., is it better to just increase in one place or aim to get them moving across the landscape?
I think the priority is to make places safe, and the risk, in connecting, the risk is that you are taking animals who use those corridors to places that are unsafe. And so, yes, it would be good to make forest areas larger, but it's extremely difficult to restore large areas of forest. I mean, if you have to put 10,000 plants into a hectare, it's just such a huge amount of work to make many hectares. But yes, I think firstly, they have to be made safe, and there will be a point where increasing their size has benefit. And at that point, you should connect. I'm puzzled by the drive to build corridors, because I don't see lack of connectivity as being a primary limiting factor for any New Zealand forest birds. I mean, it's a thing that you would do if, like Little Barrier Island, like Hoturu or somewhere, that it was full. If a place was at K and subadults were dying because they could not find territories, which is what happens on islands at K, then if you were to connect, you'll get genetic exchange, and you would enable those subadults to go and find new territories. But we have no mainland places in that situation. I mean, well, perhaps Zealandia, for some species. And so pest-fenced eco-sanctuaries probably get, quote, full, unquote. And in that case, I think eco-sanctuaries that spill over into surrounding landscapes is a fabulous recipe for doing the best we can with current tools for restoration on the mainland. Yep. I mean, one of the dilemmas, and as Kevin Parker says, and I mentioned in my talk, that if you connect places, that things can escape. And if you translocate birds carefully to a place, and we get this with things like kōkako, if you put them into 1,000 hectares of protected parongia, and there's another 19,000 hectares they might go to, well, quite often they go there. And so translocated birds can leave safe protected places if they are connected. So it's a twin-edged sword connectivity. You know, the dilemma is that it takes a long time probably to establish corridors, and we know very little about the kind of floristics or physical structures of corridors that might work. Sorry, has this been a really rambling answer?
No, that's great.
I think making all these places safe is the best thing first. So that would be fence and predator control. And then, yeah, connecting. I mean, I'm all for planting, you know, connecting, you know, do it, but don't enable birds to leave safe places to go to unsafe places.
Okay. A comment actually on the stoat question. Elaine writes, I think stoats are more even in abundance in the North Island and boom and bust in the South Island. I wouldn't say they were at low abundance. So there's
Okay,
another
thanks.
perspective on that.
No, is that Elaine Murphy?
Just says Elaine, but quite possibly.
She'll be right.
Audience question, do we know what proportion of a shipwrack's diet is made up birds and their eggs versus fruits and insects?
Yes, and birds and eggs are tiny. So they are not a primary diet item. You know, they are on the side, and that in that situation, rats can drive birds to extremely low numbers. So if birds go extinct, shipwrack populations will not be affected. They are sustained by, I mean, around most of the world, shipwracks, in fact, have a majority of their diet is fruit and seeds, with a minor component of invertebrates and whatever else, you know, and anything else that they might find. In New Zealand, I think because of the unique availability of weta, we tend to have a predominance of invertebrates. Weta in particular, you know, are incredibly abundant in shipwrack diets. But the birds are on the side, and that's a dangerous situation for the birds. So there's no density, there's no feedback. If birds decline, then shipwracks will decline also. It doesn't happen like that. They'll just keep eating birds if they can get hold of them.
Thank you. Question, deer have erupted across the Wellington region. Do we understand the effects on the deep endemic insectivores, e.g. riflemen?
No, I think it's an incredible research gap. We talk about that a lot, about the demise of research and action on deer, about spreading deer, red deer and fallow deer, and about this absence of research about, you know, the so what question, and certainly in relation to birds. And so it's among a myriad, I think, of food supply and you know, other non-predation questions that are around in New Zealand at the moment and deserve study.
Okay.
I mean, one imagines that, I mean, they're taking out understory and they're reducing, you know, floristic diversity in the long term, and that's uneven, of course. I mean, there's palatable species and not so palatable, and so the flowers and fruits or invertebrates associated with those palatable species are not available to invertebrates. So one imagine that has some effect, but it's part of the complexity of food that I talked about.
Maybe one final question. Dave Kelly asks, what's the suite of predators around the edges of cities, and does this provide some sort of refuge? Maybe more cats, fewer stoats. What result?
Yes, if I've understood that right, I think I agree with that. I mean, there are very few stoats in cities. So we've been looking with cameras and things across 4 or 5 New Zealand cities in, well, what's now called Restoring Urban Nature, People, Cities, Nature. It was a Waikato-led MB program. There are very few mustelids in cities. I think Wellington's had a few. We may have had one ferret in Hamilton, but stoats are almost unheard of. I think it's the high cat numbers. So I agree with Dave. I think the high cats, I remember Yolanda van Heesek published that cats in Dunedin killed 28,000 shiprats a year. I know it's not popular to see cats as doing some good. I think they probably do. I'm not, that's not a blanket statement about cats across New Zealand at all, and it's not a statement about feral cats, but I suspect that ship rats are much less abundant in towns than they would be if cats were not there. So to some extent, I think there's some refugia attributes of that outcome. But of course, habitat is poor. There's small urban parks. Probably understory is quite good. I mean, there's no deer, of course. It's an extraordinary fauna, urban fauna. Does that cover what Dave asked?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Oh, thanks heaps for that, John. I'm sure everybody that's sitting around their computers will give you a big clap for such a sterling effort on the questions. It was quite extended.